At 34, my father disowned me in front of 300 investors at our company's 40th anniversary gala, handed 100% of the future to my younger sister, and forgot one detail. I legally controlled 51% of the voting shares. My name is Ilara Whitmore, and the night he erased me from the stage was the night I removed a 63-year-old CEO from his own empire in 30 days. Chapter 1. The ballroom at the Pierre glowed like it always does in late spring, all crystal chandeliers and polished marble, the kind of room that makes you stand up straighter whether you want to or not. It was May 2024, and Whitmore Development Group was celebrating 40 years in business, 40 years since my grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, signed the first lease on a narrow commercial property in Midtown and decided she was not going to let a room full of men tell her what she could or could not build. Her portrait stood near the entrance tonight, framed in silver, a black and white photograph from the early 1980s. She looked fearless in it. I wondered what she would think of this version of her company. I am Ilara Whitmore. I am 34 years old. I graduated from the University of Michigan in 2012 with a degree in economics. I joined the family company in 2016, not as an executive, not as a future heir, but as a compliance analyst. I finished my MBA part-time at NYU Stern in 2022, studying at night after long days reviewing contracts and risk assessments. I have spent 8 years inside Whitmore Development Group, reading every footnote, every disclosure, every line most people skim. I was not an outsider. I just was never the one being introduced. More than 300 guests filled the ballroom, investors in tailored suits, developers from Chicago and Dallas, members of the Upper East Side social circle my mother navigates like a second language. Champagne glasses clinked, a string quartet played something soft and forgettable. My father stood at the center of it all. Charles Whitmore, 63, Chief Executive Officer, my father. He looked confident, composed, almost warm. He spoke about legacy, about growth, about resilience through the post-pandemic commercial market downturn. He spoke about the future. He did not speak about me. He paused, glanced toward my younger sister at the front table, and smiled in a way I had learned to recognize as deliberate. Tonight is not only about celebrating 40 years, he said. It is about looking ahead, about ensuring Whitmore Development continues to be led with vision and strength. The room quieted. Camille has proven herself in the most demanding legal environments in this country. Her experience at one of Chicago's top firms, her discipline, her leadership. I am proud to announce that she will be stepping into a formal leadership track within Whitmore Development as we begin planning for the next generation. Applause filled the ballroom. Camille stood, composed in a navy gown, smiling with the kind of grace that makes people believe everything has always come easily to you. She is 31, brilliant, sharp, and for most of our lives, the golden child. Northwestern Law class of 2017, corporate attorney in Chicago, the daughter who fit the story better. No one looked at me. I was seated at a table near the back, next to a regional property manager and his wife. I felt the heat rise behind my ribs, not because I had expected something different, but because this time it was official, public, final. Invisible is one thing, erased is another. After the applause faded and the band resumed playing, I made my way backstage. My heels echoed against the hallway floor. I found my father near a service entrance, speaking with a longtime investor. When he saw me, he gave a polite nod, the kind you give a colleague. "Can we talk?" I said. The investor excused himself. My father checked his watch. "Make it quick, Ilara." I stood there, hands steady at my sides. "Do you see me as part of this company's future at all?" He did not hesitate. "You are part of the company," he said, "in the capacity that suits you." "What does that mean?" "You are analytical, detail-oriented, you support operations well. Leadership requires a different presence, a different instinct, a different temperament," I finished. He sighed, not angry, just tired. "Camille commands a room. She understands power. This is not personal." "It never is," I said. For a moment, I thought he might soften. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks. Do not turn this into something it is not. We all have our roles. That was the moment it stopped being about a title. It became confirmation. I walked back into the ballroom feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. The music swelled. Guests laughed. My mother stood beside Camille, hand resting proudly at her back. I slipped outside into the cool air along Fifth Avenue. That's where Jonathan Reyes found me. He had been my grandmother's estate and corporate attorney for over 20 years. 52 years old, precise, measured, a man who rarely rushed his words. "Ilara," he said quietly, "I've been trying to find the right moment to speak with you." "Is this about tonight?" I asked. "It is about something that predates tonight." We stepped a few feet away from the entrance. Traffic hummed. A cab honked in the distance. "Your grandmother established an irrevocable trust in September 2022. The trust holds 51% of the voting shares of Whitmore Development Group." I blinked. That's not possible. Dad holds controlling interest. He held it operationally, not beneficially. He explained carefully, as if he were walking through a contract clause. The trust was structured under New York law. It's notarized, 2 independent witnesses. There's also a recorded video statement dated September 12, 2022. Your grandmother anticipated a scenario in which governance could become compromised by concentrated authority. Compromised how? By decisions made without adequate transparency, or by sidelining stakeholders whose perspectives were necessary for long-term stability. "You mean me?" He did not smile. "The trustee was given discretionary authority to transfer voting control to you if there was evidence of potential breach of fiduciary duty or misuse of power. Tonight's public declaration, combined with recent internal decisions, constitutes that threshold." My mind caught on one phrase: recent internal decisions. Jonathan held my gaze. "There are concerns regarding a letter of intent signed last November related to the Chicago riverfront property. Disclosure to the board appears incomplete." My father. The city noise seemed to fade. "If he contests this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "There is a no contest clause," Jonathan replied. "Any beneficiary who challenges the validity of the trust risks forfeiting remaining interests tied to it." "And the board?" "An emergency board meeting can be called under the bylaws with sufficient director signatures. The trustee is prepared to recognize your standing as beneficiary of the majority voting shares once that meeting is convened." This was not a dramatic reveal. It was clinical, legal, documented. "You are certain?" I asked. I would not be standing here if I were not. Inside, the music shifted into something louder. Applause erupted again for a toast. "Your grandmother believed control was a responsibility, not a prize. She chose you because she believed you would not mistake it for one." For a long moment, I said nothing. All my life I had been the practical one, be careful one, the one who read the fine print. I assumed that was why I was never center stage. Now I understood that it might have been why she trusted me. I returned to the ballroom briefly, not to confront anyone, but to observe. Camille laughing with investors, my father shaking hands, confident in a future he believed secure. He did not know. Not yet. Later that night, I took a cab back to my apartment in Manhattan, a 1-bedroom rental I had paid for myself since 2018. No family subsidy, no trust fund deposits, just my salary of $192,000 a year and the quiet satisfaction of independence. I changed into sweats and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop. Jonathan had emailed me the trust documents. Irrevocable, notarized, signed. 51% voting shares. I opened the first page. Control is a responsibility, not a reward. I read the line 3 times. This was not about revenge. It was not about humiliating my father the way he humiliated me. It was about governance, about whether the company my grandmother built would become a vehicle for ego or remain an institution. Outside my window, the city kept moving, sirens in the distance, a train rumbling underground. For the first time that night, I felt something other than hurt. I felt the weight of choice, and I knew the next move would not be made from a ballroom stage. It would be made in a boardroom. Chapter 2. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, not because I was anxious, but because my mind had already started arranging the pieces. Jonathan had sent over a more detailed summary overnight. I read it again at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The trust had been established in September of 2022 under New York estate and trust law. 2 independent witnesses, notarized, a recorded video statement stored with the firm. After my grandmother passed in March 2023, the 51% of voting shares she held were transferred into the trust as specified. The beneficial interests shifted immediately, but the actual voting authority remained dormant. Dormant until the trustee determined there was reasonable evidence of governance risk or breach of fiduciary duty. The language was careful. It did not mention me as a victim. It mentioned structural integrity, transparency, long-term stability. Jonathan had also been clear about one other thing. If my father attempted to contest the trust in court, he would trigger the no contest clause and potentially forfeit any remaining benefits tied to the secondary family trust my grandmother had established years earlier. He could challenge it, but it would not be a simple emotional lawsuit. It would be a calculated financial risk. I did not feel triumphant reading any of this. I felt the weight of responsibility settle into something solid. I requested a meeting with Margaret Hale that afternoon. Margaret had been on the Whitmore Development Board longer than I had been alive. 74 years old, silver hair always perfectly styled, posture straight as a column. She had joined the company in the late 1980s, back when my grandmother was still personally negotiating leases and walking construction sites in heels. We met in her townhouse on the Upper East Side. She poured tea into porcelain cups and listened without interrupting as I laid out what Jonathan had explained. When I finished, she leaned back and studied me. "Your grandmother worried about this," she said quietly. "About Dad?" "About concentration of authority without accountability, about decisions made too quickly and disclosed too late." "The Chicago riverfront property," I said. She nodded once. "I was not fully briefed on the terms before the letter of intent was signed last November. That bothered me." The Chicago riverfront building had been one of our most valuable mixed-use assets. Signed in November 2023, I had learned from Jonathan, a letter of intent with a private equity firm that, according to internal records, had personal ties to my father. "You believe it was a breach?" I asked. "I believe it was not handled with the transparency required at that level," she replied. "That is enough for concern." I took a breath. "Under the bylaws, how do we call an emergency meeting?" Margaret did not hesitate. 3 director signatures, a written petition citing governance concern, notice to the board secretary. It can be done within 10 days. "Will you sign?" She looked at me for a long moment. "If I sign, Charles will know immediately. There will be no quiet path back from that." "I know." Her expression softened slightly. "Eleanor trusted you for a reason. If you are prepared to act from duty and not from anger, I will sign." I felt something steady inside me. "I am not angry," I said. "I am done being sidelined." Margaret signed the petition that afternoon. I needed 2 more directors. That night, I reviewed internal compliance files. As senior compliance analyst, I had access to archived email trails, disclosure logs, and draft summaries prepared for board packets. I did not need to dig illegally. I needed to read carefully. The Chicago Riverfront Letter of Intent was signed in November 2023. The disclosure summary provided to the board in December was abbreviated. Certain risk projections were softened. A reference to a prior business relationship between my father and one of the private equity partners was absent. It was not outright fraud. It was omission. In governance, omission matters. The following morning, I requested a meeting with Daniel Brooks, our chief financial officer. 58 years old, pragmatic, cautious, loyal to the company if not always to my father. We met in his office overlooking Park Avenue. "You know what this looks like," Daniel said after I outlined the trust and petition. "I know what the documents say." He rubbed his forehead. "The Chicago deal is complex. There are strategic reasons." "Strategic does not mean undisclosed," I replied. He watched me carefully. "If this board fight destabilizes investor confidence, the deal could collapse. If the deal collapses because investors question transparency, that is already instability." Silence hung between us. "You are asking me to pick a side," he said. "I am asking you to acknowledge what you know." He did not commit to signing the petition that day, but he did not dismiss it either. By the end of the week, I had secured a second director signature through a private conversation grounded in fiduciary responsibility rather than family conflict. The third took longer. It required explaining the legal mechanics of the trust and showing evidence of incomplete disclosure. On the fourth day, the petition was formally submitted to the board secretary. My father learned about it within hours. My phone rang just after 7 that evening. "What exactly are you doing, Alara?" he said without greeting. "Following procedure? Do you have any idea what this will do to our reputation? If governance cannot withstand review, our reputation has larger problems." His voice sharpened. "You are being manipulated. This is about money, about ego. It is about disclosure." He exhaled heavily. "If you move forward, I will have no choice but to examine the circumstances under which your grandmother amended her estate. Undue influence is a serious allegation." He was testing me, threatening without committing. "The trust has a no contest clause," I said calmly. "You know that." There was a pause. "You think paperwork makes you powerful?" "No," I replied. "It makes the process transparent." We ended the call without resolution. Over the next few days, tension inside the company shifted. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Emails were more formal. My calendar invitations carried a new edge. And yet something else happened too. A few mid-level managers stopped by my office to appreciate the push for clarity, quietly, off the record. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for mid-June 2024 at Whitmore Tower. The official notice cited governance concerns related to recent transactions and the need to review executive authority. When the final confirmation email arrived, I stared at the date for a long time. I was no longer the daughter asking to be acknowledged. I was a stakeholder invoking procedure. The room I would walk into was not a ballroom with chandeliers and applause. It was a boardroom with 12 seats and no illusions. For the first time in years, I felt aligned with my grandmother's voice in my memory. Not loud, not dramatic, just certain. The meeting was set, and this time, every person at that table would have to look at me.
Chapter 3. I arrived at Whitmore Tower 20 minutes early. Mid-June sunlight reflected off the glass facade, turning the building into a mirror of the city that had shaped all of us. I had walked through these doors for 8 years as an employee. Today, I walked in as something else. The lobby felt colder than usual. The receptionist gave me a tight smile. I could sense the ripple of awareness that had traveled through the company over the past week. People knew something significant was happening on the 41st floor. When I stepped into the private elevator reserved for board members, security followed me with a hesitant glance. "There is no listing for you on the executive access log," one of them said politely. I held his gaze. "There should be." He checked again, frowned slightly. I waited. I did not argue. A moment later, the elevator doors reopened, and Margaret Hale stepped out, crisp navy suit, expression calm. She looked at the security guard. "Ilara Whitmore is the beneficiary of the majority voting trust. She has full standing at this meeting." Her voice was steady, authoritative, not raised. The guard nodded and stepped aside. The ride up to the 41st floor felt longer than it ever had. I watched the numbers light up one by one. My heart beat faster, but my hands were steady. The boardroom doors were already open when I arrived. 12 seats, a long walnut table, floor-to-ceiling windows framing Midtown Manhattan. Robert Klein, 66, chairman of the board, sat at the head. Beside him were directors who had known me since I was a child. Others had joined more recently, after my grandmother stepped back. My father stood near the window, speaking quietly with Daniel Brooks. When he saw me enter, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Robert cleared his throat. "Let us begin." I took a seat midway down the table, not at the head, not at the far end, a deliberate choice. Robert opened the meeting by acknowledging the petition submitted under Section 14.3 of the company bylaws. The language was procedural, careful. Charles then leaned forward, hands clasped. "Before we entertain this motion, I would like to address the basis for it." His eyes settled on me. "Ilara has built her career in compliance. That is admirable. But she has never managed operations, negotiated large-scale acquisitions, or led teams at the executive level. What we are witnessing is an emotional response to a succession announcement, not a governance crisis." A few directors shifted in their seats. I felt the familiar urge to defend myself personally. I let it pass. Robert turned to me. "Miss Whitmore, you have requested this meeting. You may proceed." I placed a slim folder in front of each director, copies of the trust instrument, summary of the estate transfer, and my compliance analysis. The irrevocable trust was established in September 2022 under New York law, I began. It was executed with 2 independent witnesses and notarized. There is also a recorded video statement confirming intent in capacity. I did not rush. Upon my grandmother's passing in March 2023, 51% of the voting shares were transferred into the trust. The trustee retained discretionary authority to assign voting control if there was evidence of governance risk or breach of fiduciary duty. My father shifted in his chair. "This is highly irregular," he said. "It is legal," I replied evenly. I turned to the second section of the folder. The Chicago Riverfront Letter of Intent signed in November 2023 presents material concerns. Specifically, the absence of full disclosure regarding prior relationships between executive leadership and the acquiring firm. A director to my left frowned. "Are you alleging misconduct, Ilara?" "I am alleging incomplete disclosure and potential conflict of interest exposure." My father leaned forward. "That relationship was immaterial. The valuation was independently assessed." Daniel cleared his throat. "Some aspects of the relationship were not included in the board packet distributed in December," he said quietly. The room stilled. Robert looked at Daniel. "Clarify." Daniel adjusted his glasses. "The prior business association between Mr. Whitmore and one of the managing partners at the private equity firm was not explicitly referenced in the board packet." My father turned sharply toward him. "It was not relevant." "Relevance is determined collectively, not individually," Margaret said. Silence stretched across the table. I continued. "Under our fiduciary obligations, transparency is not optional. Even the appearance of partial disclosure can undermine investor confidence and expose us to legal scrutiny." Charles exhaled sharply. "So this is about optics now. This is about duty." Robert folded his hands. "Is there any additional evidence of material risk tied to this transaction?" I slid a final document forward. An internal email chain discussing projected lease stabilization timelines that differ from those presented in the summary. The variance is not illegal, it is simply not aligned. One of the newer directors spoke up. "Why was this not addressed earlier?" "Because compliance reports do not override executive authority," I said. "They inform it." My father stood. This is an ambush orchestrated by a daughter who felt slighted at a public event. I met his eyes. If this were about a public event, we would not be discussing disclosure documents from last November. He looked at me for a long moment, anger flickering beneath composure. Robert leaned back in his chair. "The motion before us is not to adjudicate personal grievances. It is to determine whether there is sufficient basis for a vote of no confidence under Section 14.3. He looked around the table. "Any final statements?" My father spoke again, slower now. I have led this company through volatile markets, through recession, through pandemic disruption. I have delivered returns. I have protected jobs. Do not confuse a strategic decision with ethical compromise. Margaret responded softly. Leadership is not measured only by returns. It is measured by how decisions are shared. Robert nodded. We will proceed to vote. Each director was asked to state their vote clearly. No raised hands, no secret ballot. Yes. Yes. No. Yes. Abstain. The pattern continued, deliberate and audible. When the final count was read, it landed with a weight that felt both inevitable and unreal. 7 in favor of the motion, 4 opposed, 1 abstention. Robert spoke evenly. The motion carries. Under Section 14.3, the board requests that Charles Whitmore tender his resignation as Chief Executive Officer within 30 days. There was no applause, no visible celebration. My father did not react immediately. He stood very still, eyes forward, as if the city skyline beyond the windows held some alternative outcome. Finally, he spoke. This is a mistake. No one responded. He gathered his papers with precise movements. As he walked past me, he paused. You believe you have won something today. You have no idea what you have set in motion. I did not answer. When the room slowly emptied, directors offering brief nods or cautious acknowledgments as they left, I remained seated. The sunlight had shifted, casting long shadows across the table. Margaret approached me. You handled that well, she said. I did not feel victorious. It is not over, I replied. She gave a faint smile. It never is. Eventually, I stood and walked to the window where my father had been standing earlier. The city below moved without awareness of what had just happened 41 floors above. I had not shouted, I had not humiliated him, I had invoked process. And yet the ground had shifted. As I left the boardroom, I understood something with sudden clarity. The vote had removed him from the position of unquestioned authority inside that room. But outside it, in the press, in investor calls, in private conversations across Manhattan and beyond, the real contest was only beginning.
Chapter 4. The first headline hit my phone before I even made it through the lobby doors. I was walking into Whitmore Tower for what I thought would be a routine morning of follow-ups and transition planning. And there it was, on a real estate industry site that investors actually read. A photo of our building, a caption about internal turmoil, a headline that made my stomach tighten. The article frames everything as a family fight, not governance, not fiduciary duty, not board oversight. A daughter overturning her father, a corporate throne grab disguised as reform. Within hours, it spread. LinkedIn posts, group chats, side comments from people who had never stepped inside our boardroom but suddenly had strong opinions about what happened in it. Daniel Brooks found me in the hallway outside my office with his tie slightly loosened, phone pressed to his ear. He ended the call when he saw my face. Olivia Chen, he said, PR firm. Your father hired her last month. Last month? Before the vote. Before the petition even landed on the board secretary desk. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. Charles had not been blindsided. He had been prepared. He had simply assumed he would not need the plan. What is she pushing? I asked. Daniel gave a grim half shrug. Undue influence, mental state, family instability. All the words that make investors nervous without making any statements you can sue over. I sat at my desk and opened the article again, forcing myself to read it without flinching. It cited unnamed sources. It implied my grandmother had been manipulated in her final years. It suggested I was an untested employee who had somehow seized control through paperwork rather than competence. It never mentioned the Chicago riverfront disclosure concerns. It never mentioned fiduciary duty. It never mentioned that the board voted 7-4 with 1 abstention. It only mentioned drama. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Please do not respond publicly. Let this settle. I stared at the screen, feeling the familiar old pressure to make things easier for everyone else. Then another message came in, this time from Margaret Hale. Do not let them define the story. Keep to facts. Facts outlive noise. An hour later, I received an email from Laura Mitchell, a journalist who covered commercial real estate and governance. She wanted comment for a piece she was writing. The subject line was blunt: Governance Crisis at Whitmore Development. I knew enough about media to understand what that meant. It meant the story had moved beyond gossip and into the category of professional scrutiny. That was both terrifying and necessary. I called Jonathan Reyes. He answered on the first ring. I expected this, he said. My father hired a PR firm, I replied. I know. He also asked around about contesting the trust. My heart jumped. He can still try. He can try, Jonathan said calmly. He can also set a pile of money on fire. The no contest clause is real, and the documentation is clean. The better question is what he is trying to accomplish outside of court. Control the narrative, I said. Exactly. I looked out my window at Midtown, the city moving like nothing inside my chest was changing. How do we stop it? You do not stop it by arguing feelings, Jonathan said. You stop it by making the process visible. The next day, Robert Klein convened a small transition committee meeting, not the full board, but enough to stabilize operations. Daniel Brooks, head of legal, head of HR, and Sophia Turner, our head of investor relations. Sophia was 49, sharp as glass, the kind of woman who could take a room full of skeptical investors and make them listen without raising her voice. She opened her laptop and turned it toward us. We have an activist shareholder, Michael Alvarez, she said. He holds about 4%. He's pushing for a town hall. Robert frowned. Town hall? Sophia nodded. He wants transparency. He's not wrong. But it will be tense. The market is sensitive. The press is circling. If we do not address it, he will make noise in a way we cannot control. Daniel shifted in his seat. The Chicago deal is already fragile. I looked at Sophia. How soon? She glanced at her calendar. 10 days after the vote would be the earliest we can pull it together responsibly. Notice to shareholders, legal review of messaging, prep for questions. Robert looked at me. Ilara, you will need to speak. I felt a knot tighten at the base of my throat. I'm not the CEO. You are the beneficiary of the majority voting trust, Robert said. You initiated the governance review. Whether or not you like it, the market will want to hear from you. There was no comfort in that, only reality. Over the next week, the company felt like a house with the walls removed. Conversations happened behind closed doors, phones rang constantly. People watched every move I made as if my posture alone could raise or lower the value of a building. I received a call from Camille in Chicago one late night. Her voice sounded controlled, but I could hear strain underneath. Are you happy now? I closed my eyes. That's not what this is about. You have people online calling me a nepotism puppet. They're tagging my firm. My partner asked me if I knew about the trust. Do you understand what you did? I held the phone tighter. I didn't do this to hurt you. It doesn't matter what you intended, she snapped. It matters what everyone sees. Her words hit a nerve. For so long, what everyone saw had been the story my father curated. I kept my voice even. I'm not fighting for a seat at his table anymore. I'm fighting so the table is not used to hide things. She did not reply. Then, quieter, she said, Mom is scared. I know. Camille exhaled. Just don't burn everything down. The call ended without resolution, leaving a hollow silence in my apartment. 10 days after the vote, we held the investor town hall in a conference space on the 38th floor of Whitmore Tower. Not a ballroom, no chandeliers, just rows of chairs, microphones, and a large screen behind us displaying the company logo. Sophia stood near the entrance, greeting people with practiced warmth. Some investors attended in person, others joined virtually, faces appearing in small boxes on the screen. I sat on the panel beside Robert Klein and Daniel Brooks. We had legal counsel in the front row, prepared to jump in if the discussion drifted into anything that could trigger liability. When it started, Sophia introduced the session, then turned to me. My hands were steady as I took the microphone, but my heartbeat was loud in my ears. I did not give a speech about family. I gave a statement about governance. I talked about process, about the board vote, about fiduciary duty, about the need for transparency in major transactions. I confirmed that the Chicago riverfront deal was under internal review and temporarily paused until the review was complete. Then the questions began. Most were cautious, technical, predictable. What is the timeline for leadership transition? Who is acting as interim executive decision maker? How will this affect quarterly projections? Then one man stood up in the third row, mid-50s, crisp shirt, no tie. His tone was polite, but his eyes were sharp. "Do you actually have the competence to guide this company?" he asked. "Or are you just the beneficiary of a trust who happened to be in the right place at the right time?" The room went very still. I felt the old shame try to rise, the part of me that wanted to shrink, the part of me that had spent years being quiet so my father could remain comfortable. I did not let it win. I looked directly at him. "I understand why you are asking," I said. "So here are facts. I have worked inside Whitmore Development since 2016 in compliance. My job has been to identify risk before it becomes loss. In 2021, I wrote a risk audit warning that our office portfolio would see a sharper decline in occupancy after the pandemic than our projections assumed. That audit was filed. It was not acted on quickly. The market proved it correct." I paused, letting that settle. "I completed an MBA at NYU Stern in 2022 while working full-time. I have not been an executive, but I have been the person reading every document that executives sign. I know what creates liability and what protects value. That is why the board petitioned for review. That is why the transaction in Chicago is paused. This is not about a throne. It is about governance." He did not look satisfied, but he sat down. In the back of the room, I saw Michael Alvarez watching me closely. He did not smile, he did not nod. He simply listened, as if measuring whether I was real. When the town hall ended, people filed out with quieter energy than they arrived with. Some investors stopped to shake Robert's hand. A few approached me with restrained professionalism, the kind that says, "I still do not like this, but I respect that you showed up." That evening, Laura Netchell published her piece. It was not flattering, but it was accurate. She wrote about a governance conflict, not a daughter tantrum. 2 days later, the internal review report came back to the board. Robert called me into his office with Margaret already there. He did not waste time. The review confirms that Charles did not fully disclose his prior business relationship with one of the private equity managing partners involved in the Chicago letter of intent, he said. "There is no criminal finding, but the board considers it a breach of our transparency standards." Margaret watched my face carefully. "Do you understand what this means?" she asked. I did. It meant the story shifted, not to a fairy tale where I was instantly believed, but to a reality where the company had a documented reason for oversight beyond family dynamics. It also meant my father had been willing to gamble with the company credibility to maintain control. Sophia called me later that night. "The stock is stabilizing," she said. "Not soaring, stabilizing. Investors like clarity more than they like perfection." I set my phone down and opened my laptop again, reviewing the next set of transition documents Robert had sent: interim leadership arrangements, compliance oversight, communication plans for staff. I was not being treated like a rebel tonight. I was being treated like someone responsible for keeping a system steady. And that felt heavier than the humiliation ever had. Chapter 5. By September 2024, the air in Manhattan had shifted. The heat had eased, the city felt sharper, and the Whitmore name no longer floated above everything like a fixed star. My father was gone from the board. Not in a dramatic way, not with security walking him out, not with a courtroom spectacle. He resigned the way powerful men often do when they run out of leverage, quietly, with a statement drafted by attorneys, a few carefully chosen lines about prioritizing stability and avoiding distraction. The internal review had concluded weeks earlier, and the conclusion was enough. No criminal findings, no handcuffs, no tabloid scandal, just a documented failure to disclose a personal business relationship tied to a major transaction, and a board that had decided it was unacceptable. The old circles noticed. The Real Estate Council of New York removed him from a leadership seat he had held for years. They did not announce it with drama, they simply updated a list. Invitations stopped arriving. People who used to call him back within minutes started letting his calls go to voicemail. He was not bankrupt. He still had money, connections, assets, but he was no longer the center of gravity. That is the kind of consequence that stings someone like him more than any headline. For me, the consequence arrived in a different form. One morning, Sophia Turner sent me a link with a single line of text. "Olivia is trying one more time." It was a piece posted on a niche industry blog, not mainstream, but read by enough people to cause ripples. The writer did not name Olivia Chen, of course. It was framed as analysis. The language was slick and careful. A cautionary tale about corporate governance being hijacked by personal ambition. A warning about untested insiders who mistake legal technicalities for leadership. A subtle implication that the board had been pressured into a vote, that the company would regret it. It did not accuse me directly of wrongdoing. It did something worse. It suggested I was overreaching. I read it twice, then a third time, waiting for my chest to tighten the way it would have a year ago. It did not, because the internal review was already public in the ways that mattered, not publicly posted on a website, but available through investor communications, referenced in official disclosures, backed by board minutes and documentation. Anyone serious could see what had happened. Anyone casual could keep believing a story about family drama. Sophia called me from her office. "Do you want to respond?" "No," I said. "You are sure?" "Facts do not need my anger to support them." She paused, then let out a small breath. "Good, because if we respond, it becomes a debate. If we do nothing, it stays what it is, noise." And she was right. Within 48 hours, the piece started to backfire. People in the industry did what they always do when someone tries to manipulate them. They started asking for receipts. A thread popped up on LinkedIn, blunt and skeptical. "If she is so unqualified, why did 7 board members vote no confidence?" Another person commented that the real story was a governance gap that had finally been exposed. Olivia Chen did not lose because I wrote a better narrative. She lost because she underestimated how much investors hate uncertainty dressed up as scandal. Still, it was exhausting. Not in the way humiliation was exhausting. This was the exhaustion of staying steady while other people tried to make you flinch. On a Tuesday in mid-September, Robert Klein asked me to stop by his office. He looked older than he had in June. Not weak, just tired. Governance work ages people quietly. "Charles signed the final resignation paperwork this morning," he said. I nodded. "He will also be stepping away from any advisory roles he still held informally." Understood. Robert studied me. "This has not been easy. I know people forget that you are not only a stakeholder, you are his daughter." I kept my voice neutral. "They can forget. I cannot." He leaned back. "The board is ready for your proposal on the new division." That was my next move. Not a victory lap, not a revenge speech, a plan. I had drafted it over weeks, building off work I had been doing quietly for years: sustainability compliance, tenant energy standards, resilience planning for commercial properties, things that mattered long-term, even when people pretended they did not. I wanted Whitmore Development to grow up, to stop operating like a private kingdom and start operating like an institution that could outlive the egos inside it. Later that week, my mother asked to see me. Vivian Whitmore had always been polished, always composed, always surrounded by committees and charity galas, and women who knew how to smile without revealing anything real. She asked me to meet her at a quiet cafe on the Upper East Side, the kind of place where conversations are soft, where no one raises their voice, where nothing messy is allowed on the table. She arrived in a cream coat and pearl earrings, as if she were still attending a luncheon. When she sat down, she looked at me for a long moment before speaking. She said, "I did not expect this to happen this way." I replied, "I did." Her lips tightened, then she surprised me by letting her shoulders slump just slightly. She said, "I thought if I kept everything calm, if I kept everyone smiling, it would protect the family." I replied, "It protected his image, not me." She looked down at her hands. She said, "I know." That word landed heavy, not an apology, not yet, but an admission. She continued, "I was afraid of what would happen if I challenged him, afraid of becoming the target, afraid of losing the life I built, the social circle, the foundation, everything." I watched her carefully. "You chose those things over me." Her eyes shimmered, but she did not cry. She said, "I chose survival, and I told myself it was the same as protecting you." Silence stretched between us. I did not reach across the table. I did not offer her comfort, not because I wanted to punish her, because comfort would have been another form of erasing what happened. I said, "I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm asking you not to rewrite it." She nodded slowly. "I will not." That was as close as we came to peace that day. 2 days later, Camille texted me, "Can we talk in person?" She was back in New York for a weekend, and she suggested that we meet in Brooklyn Heights. By then, I had moved. I left my Manhattan rental in July and signed a lease in Brooklyn Heights on my own, a quiet apartment with morning light and a view of trees instead of glass. It felt like a boundary you could live inside. We met at a small coffee shop a few blocks from my building. Camille arrived looking different than she had at the Pierre, less polished, more tired. Her hair was pulled back without effort. Her eyes carried something raw. We sat at a corner table. She stared at her cup for a while, then finally looked up. She said, "I'm in therapy." I blinked. "With Dr. Hannah Brooks. My firm suggested it as part of managing stress," she added, as if she needed it to sound professional. I said nothing. Camille swallowed. "People at the firm have been calling me a nepotism here. Not to my face, not directly, but the tone changed. A partner asked me if I knew about the trust. Another asked me if my father ever used the company to influence cases. None of it is fair." I agreed. It is not.
She exhaled sharply. "Sometimes I hate you for it," she admitted. "And then I hate myself for hating you because I know what he did to you. I know I watched it happen." My throat tightened. "Why did you watch?" I asked. She looked away. "Because if I said anything, he would have turned on me," she said. "And I was raised to believe that losing his approval meant losing everything." Her voice shook on the last word. Then she looked back at me, and I saw something I had rarely seen in her: fear without arrogance. "Did you do all of this for revenge?" she asked. I held her gaze. "No, I did it because I do not want to be silent anymore." She nodded, but the tension in her shoulders did not ease. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Do we just pretend we are a normal family?" I let the question hang for a moment. "We do not pretend," I said, "and we do not go back. We do something else." Camille frowned. "Like what?" "Like boundaries," I said. She flinched slightly, as if the word itself was an accusation. "I am not sharing internal documents with you," I continued. "I am not giving family access to governance. I am not letting anyone use me as a shortcut into the boardroom." Her mouth opened, then closed. "I am not asking for that," she said, a little too fast. "I am saying it anyway," I replied, "because forgiveness does not mean access.
and being sisters does not mean you get to step into my work and call it family." Camille stared at me. For a second, I thought she might lash out. Instead, she looked down and whispered, "That hurts." "I know. It is still true." She nodded slowly, like she was learning a language she had never been taught. When we left the coffee shop, we did not hug. We stood outside for a moment in the late afternoon light, cars passing, people walking dogs, a normal Brooklyn street that did not care about the Whitmore name. Camille finally said, softly, "I do not know how to be anyone if I am not the one he chose." I answered quietly, "You learn." That was all I could give her. The following week, I presented the finalized plan to Robert and the Transition Committee. Division of Sustainable Development, launching in the fourth quarter of 2024. It was not a feel-good initiative, it was a strategic move. Energy compliance standards were tightening, tenants were demanding resilience planning, investors were paying attention to long-term risk. I laid out staffing needs, reporting structure, oversight protocols, and a timeline that did not depend on charisma, only on work. Robert listened, then nodded. "This is how institutions survive," he said. When I left his office, I walked past the framed photos in the hallway, old black and white shots of my grandmother standing in hard hats, shaking hands with contractors, inspecting steel beams. I stopped in front of one of them. She was smiling, but not in a way that asked permission. I went back to my desk and signed the internal authorization to begin building the division, the first official step that proved I was not only holding the company steady, I was shaping what it would become. And for the first time since the night at the Pierre, the weight in my chest felt less like pressure and more like purpose. Chapter 6. By December 2024, Brooklyn Heights felt more like home than Manhattan ever had. I moved into this apartment in July, a quiet one-bedroom with tall windows that catch the morning light and trees lining the street below. I signed the lease myself. I wired the deposit myself. No family assistant, no trust manager hovering in the background, just my name on a contract and my own bank account covering the rent. My compensation that year was clear and documented. $192,000 in executive salary, approved by the board after the transition. Distributions from the trust based on performance and board determination. Not a windfall, not a lottery ticket, but structured income tied to results. Every dollar traceable, every decision recorded. For the first time in my life, the numbers around me did not feel like leverage, they felt like responsibility. Sometimes in the early mornings, before emails start and calls fill the day, I sit at the small dining table by the window and trace the timeline in my head. 2012, graduation from the University of Michigan, a degree and a quiet promise to myself that I would build something that did not depend on being chosen. 2016, my first day at Whitmore Development as a compliance analyst, a modest office, no executive badge, a sense of relief at simply being inside the structure my grandmother created. 2022, my grandmother sitting across from Jonathan Reyes in a law office, signing an irrevocable trust. I did not know it then. I was studying for finals at Sturm, worried about presentations and case studies, unaware that she was quietly shifting the foundation beneath us. March 2023, her funeral. My father standing strong at the podium, speaking about legacy. Me listening, feeling both grief and distance. May 2024, the ballroom at the Pierre, applause for Camille, my name omitted like it had never belonged there. June 2024, the boardroom on the 41st floor, 7 votes, 4 against, 1 abstention. My father stepping away from a role he had worn like armor. September 2024, His resignation finalized, the real estate council removing his leadership title, not a spectacle, just a quiet adjustment to a public record. December 2024. Me here. Not triumphant, not defeated. Standing. The company is different now, not radically transformed overnight, but steadier. The Division of Sustainable Development launched on schedule in the fourth quarter. We hired 2 analysts and a director with experience in urban resilience. Tenants responded with cautious optimism. Investors asked sharper questions, and we answered them with data instead of deflection. Charles no longer walks into Whitmore Tower. He does not call board members directly to influence votes. He does not drop into offices unannounced to redirect strategy. His name remains on documents as a former executive, but his presence is no longer the axis around which every decision turns. In early December, I received a calendar notification from an unknown number, a call scheduled for December 24th at 5:30 in the evening. The number was familiar. I almost declined it. Instead, I let it ring once before answering. It was quiet on his end at first. "Merry Christmas, Alara." His voice sounded older, not weak, just unarmored. "Merry Christmas." A pause. I heard faint background noise. Wind, maybe? The ocean? I imagined the house in the Hamptons, lights on, rooms too large for one person. I wanted to say something sharp, something that would balance years of dismissal. Instead, I said nothing. He cleared his throat. I read the quarterly reports, the sustainability division. "Thank you." It was not praise, it was acknowledgement. "You're making changes quickly." "I'm following board approval." Another pause. "I misjudged you," he said finally. The words did not come easily. They landed between us like something fragile. "You misjudged governance," I replied gently, "not just me." He exhaled. "Perhaps." There was no apology wrapped in it, no dramatic confession, just a shift in tone that would have been unthinkable a year ago. We spoke for less than 5 minutes, polite, controlled, no raised voices, no emotional appeals. When the call ended, I sat at my table and stared at my phone. For most of my life, I believed his approval was oxygen, that without it, I would suffocate. Now, I realized something else. Oxygen was something I generated myself. Later that week, Camille stopped by my apartment with a small box of cookies from a bakery near her old school in Chicago. She looked less defensive than she had in September. Therapy had softened some of her edges. We stood by the window, looking out at the Brooklyn Bridge in the distance. "He called you too," she said. "Yes." "Did he apologize?" "Not exactly." She nodded, not surprised. I'm learning something in therapy, that being chosen is not the same as being valued. I glanced at her. "What do you think you were chosen for?" She smiled faintly. "To continue his story." "And now?" "Now I'm trying to figure out what mine is." There was no rivalry in her voice, no competition, just a quiet recognition that we'd both been shaped by the same system in different ways. Our mother came by a few days later with a holiday card from the foundation she runs. She spoke more carefully now, as if each sentence had to pass through a filter before reaching me. "I'm proud of you," she said, almost formally. For the first time, I believed she meant it without calculation. On the last Friday before Christmas, I stayed late at Whitmore Tower. The offices were nearly empty. Holiday decorations hung discreetly in the lobby. The building felt calmer, less charged. I walked into the boardroom alone. The walnut table gleamed under soft lighting. The chairs were neatly aligned. I stood at the same spot where I had sat in June and looked at the skyline beyond the glass. I thought about my grandmother. She did not leave me 51% because I was smarter than Camille. She didn't leave it because she loved me more. She left it because she believed I would not confuse authority with entitlement. She believed I would say no when necessary. She believed I would protect the company even if it meant standing against the people who built it with me.
Legacy is not a transfer of power, it's a transfer of responsibility. For years, I wanted to be chosen, to be seen, to be named publicly as worthy. When my father left my name out of that speech in May, it felt like erasure. Now, I understand that not being chosen by him forced me to choose myself. The real inheritance was never the shares. It was the capacity to hold boundaries without turning bitter, to say no without cruelty, to lead without humiliation. I turned off the lights in the boardroom and walked back toward the elevator. The building did not feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like work. If you've ever been the one overlooked in your own family, the one whose strengths were quiet and therefore dismissed, ask yourself something honestly. Did you wait to be chosen, or did you learn to stand up and claim your place anyway? If this story resonated with you, stay here. There are more conversations about power, family, and what it really means to build something that lasts. And if you're still standing in a room where your name is never called, remember that sometimes the silence is not a verdict, it's an invitation.